I was 16 the first time silence felt heavier than air. Annapolis in winter could cut through bone, but the cold that night came from something else. The house on base was small, painted in the standard military beige that stripped away personality. It always smelled like polished floors and ironed uniforms, a place built to keep secrets quiet. My mother moved like a shadow in her own kitchen, careful with every step, careful with every sound. William Vaughn wore his rank like a second skin. Even when he took off the uniform, the authority stayed on him like a smell that wouldn't wash off. He had this way of standing in doorways, filling them with the quiet weight of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. That night started like many others. A comment at dinner, something about my future. He spoke, I answered. He didn't like my answer. It wasn't loud. I wasn't disrespectful. But in his world, any answer that wasn't a yes was rebellion. He set his glass down slow. The sound of it against the table was soft, but it snapped every nerve in my spine. My mother froze mid-breath. His eyes locked on me with that calm, patient look he always wore before the storm. He walked around the table with the measured steps of a man inspecting a battlefield he already owned. I didn't flinch. That was my mistake. He hated defiance more than fear. He struck me once. It was not a punch from a stranger. It was calculated, controlled, the kind of hit meant to remind me exactly how small I was. Something cracked beneath my ribs like dry wood splitting. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed in my head. My breath caught sharp and wet, and I folded in on myself. The floor smelled like bleach and old wood. I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked while my world tilted sideways. My mother's chair scraped against the tile. She started to say my name, but he lifted a single hand and she stopped. That was the kind of power he carried. Not shouting, just a raised hand, and fear bloomed like smoke. His voice was calm. You will not talk to me like that. Not in this house. His words were clean practiced, the voice of a man who gave orders for a living. I could feel the warm throb under my skin where bone had given way. I tasted iron in my mouth, but didn't make a sound. Making a sound would have meant he won. He crouched down so we were eye to eye. His breath smelled like whiskey. His smile was small and cruel. It's just a joke, sweetheart. Don't be so dramatic. A joke. That was what he called it. My mother stood behind him, hands trembling against the back of a chair, eyes begging me not to make it worse. She did not move toward me. She never did. She was trapped in the same house, the same silence, the same man. William straightened up, fixed his sleeves, and walked away like he had just finished some minor task. The clock in the kitchen ticked loud enough to fill the space he left behind. I pulled myself upright, slow, biting down against the pain. Every breath sent a sharp spear through my chest. I kept my eyes on the floor. If I looked at her, she would cry, and if she cried, he would hear it. We both knew the rules. Later, when he left the house, she knelt beside me. Her hands hovered but never touched. Tears gathered in her eyes, silent like everything else in that house. She whispered, "We have to stay quiet. Do you understand me, Tess? Quiet." He had already told her what story to tell. Tomorrow it would be an accident during a training run, a stumble, a bad landing, a young girl's clumsy mistake. His rank made it easy. No one would question it. Military housing didn't question their own. He reminded her that everything she had, even the roof over our heads, existed because he allowed it. If she said a word, we would be out on the street before sunrise. I remember sitting on the cold floor, fingers clutching the silver ring my father left behind. It had the faint smell of oil and metal like flight decks and open skies. My father died when I was 10. He had been everything William wasn't. Gentle, precise, real. That ring was the only thing I had left that didn't belong to William's world. I pressed the metal into my palm until the edge bit into my skin. The pain steadied me. It was the kind of pain I could own. That night, lying in the dark, ribs burning, I made a promise without speaking it aloud. I would never bow. Not to him. Not to anyone who laughed while breaking someone else. He thought he owned the silence in that house. He thought the joke would last forever. But the thing about silence is that it remembers. It waits. It sharpens itself until one day it cuts back. That promise never left me. It lived in my chest, wrapped around the broken bone he gave me waiting. Years later, when I walked into that briefing room and heard the same word again, sweetheart, the ache beneath my ribs wasn't weakness. It was memory turning into steel. The first time I set foot on Fort Liberty, the air tasted like iron and winter. Training grounds were stripped of warmth by design. Everything here was meant to grind softness into dust. You woke before dawn, ran before your lungs caught up, and learned to hold your breath until your heartbeat matched the rhythm of the machine. I had traded a house of silence for a world of commands, but at least here the rules were written down. At 16, broken ribs had taught me pain. At 18, the Navy taught me how to turn that pain into precision. Flight school was not built for mercy. The instructors had eyes like searchlights scanning for weakness. Some recruits flinched at the sound of rotor blades or the weight of the helmet pressing down like a promise. I didn't flinch. Pain was not new to me. It was the only language I spoke fluently. They called me quiet. I called it survival. When you are the smallest in the room, silence can be armor. Every morning, I wiped frost off the control panels of the training helicopters, the cold burning against my fingers. I loved it. Machines didn't lie. If you respected them, they responded. If you hesitated, they killed you clean. In the air, there was no shouting, no jokes, no hands reaching where they shouldn't. There was only wind and weight and control. I became good, not because I wanted to impress anyone, because failure meant falling, and I had already fallen once in my life. I refused to ever fall again. It was in my 3rd year when the storm came. Bering Strait, midwinter. The wind could snap metal if it wanted to. A SEAL team had been deployed on an extraction run gone wrong. A whiteout storm swallowed their landing zone. Radios went to static. Another pilot was supposed to bring them out, but the weather turned the sky into a coffin. Command was ready to scrub the mission. Too dangerous, someone said. If we wait for clear skies, we'll only bring home bodies. Those words came out of my mouth before I even realized I was speaking. The room went silent. I was 21. No one expected the quiet girl to volunteer. I signed the waiver anyway. They strapped me into the cockpit, hands cold but steady. I launched into the storm with Lieutenant Alvarez in the co-pilot seat, the only one crazy enough to trust me. The sky vanished in less than 10 minutes. The wind hit hard enough to make the helicopter groan like something alive. Snow swallowed the world. Visibility was a joke. Instruments flickered. I flew lower, searching for the faint shimmer of ice below, reading the storm like a language only I could hear. Alvarez kept shouting headings, but the storm didn't care about our math. I followed instinct. I followed the one thing storms can't fake: gravity. Tracer fire cut through the white. They were down there. Men trapped in a hole in the ice waiting for a bird that wasn't supposed to come. The rotors screamed when I forced the helicopter down into the gale. Ice slammed against the windshield. Hydraulics whined. Alvarez swore under his breath, but he never told me to stop. The landing was blind. No instruments, no guide. Just the rhythm of the machine and the quiet fury in my chest. When the hatch opened, the wind roared through the cabin like an animal. One of the SEALs staggered toward us, blood on his face, ice clinging to his gear. He looked at me like I was a hallucination. "You came," he rasped. I didn't look away. Always. We dragged them aboard one by one, frozen bodies with stubborn hearts. The last man nearly slipped when a gust hit, but Alvarez caught him. I throttled the bird up, blades slicing through the storm like knives through cloth. One engine coughed but didn't quit. We rose into a sky that didn't want us. We landed on one engine, sliding across the ice at the edge of the base like a drunk thing refusing to die. When the wheels finally stopped, I couldn't feel my hands. The SEALs stumbled out laughing through their shivers. One of them reached up and patted the side of the bird. "She brought the dead back," he said. Someone behind him muttered a name I didn't catch. It didn't matter. The mission debrief the next day was short. The SEALs had already told the story. The pilot flew through hell. The pilot came back. Someone scribbled the words on a whiteboard in the rec room. Reaper 0. It stuck. No ceremony. No medals. Just 2 words whispered through the base like a warning and a prayer. Reaper, because I went where others didn't. Zero, because I came back from nothing. I didn't smile. Names didn't change what was underneath. But something shifted. People stopped seeing the quiet girl from nowhere. They saw the storm she carried. They treated me with a careful respect, the kind you give to things that can break you if you're not paying attention. From then on, the air was mine. I lived inside it. Day after day, flight after flight, the machine became an extension of my hands, and the cold became home. Pain stopped being the weight I carried. It became the engine that drove me. Every time the wind howled through the rotors, it sounded like a promise. One day, I would return to the man who gave me the first crack in my ribs, and on that day, I would not be the girl on the floor. I would be the storm. Reaper Zero was not born in a storm. She became the storm. The orders arrived on a quiet morning that should have felt ordinary. I was sitting alone on the edge of the flight line watching the sun crawl up over Fort Liberty when the message came through. The air was thin and sharp the way it gets before the heat rises. Transfer to Coronado Naval Base. Effective immediately. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my memory. Coronado. The name hit like cold water on bare skin. I folded the paper twice until it became a sharp edge in my palm. Orders were orders. You didn't question them. But some places don't just exist on a map. They live under your skin. Coronado was one of them. It was where the story began. I arrived 3 days later. The California sun burned bright across the base, but I felt cold stepping off the transport. The smell of salt water and jet fuel hit me like a hand on the shoulder. Familiar. Unwanted. The runway stretched out toward the ocean lined with aircraft glinting in the light. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a grave I thought I'd left behind. People moved with the clean precision of military rhythm boots hitting pavement in perfect sync. I moved through the gate with the practiced ease of someone who belonged, even if part of me wanted to turn around and never come back. Inside the command building, the air conditioner hummed too loud. The hallways looked the same as they did 17 years ago. White walls, brass plates, the smell of bleach. Everything neat, sharp, unforgiving. It was the kind of place built to erase history while keeping it alive in every corner. My boots clicked down the corridor, a sound too loud in my ears. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. The nameplate read, Admiral William R. Vaughn. I stared at the letters longer than I should have. The last time I'd seen his name carved into something official, I was 16 and broken in more ways than one. Now it sat on polished brass, clean and proud, like nothing had ever happened. I walked into the briefing room where my assignment officer waited. His voice was efficient, emotionless, the way military briefings always were. Lieutenant Commander Vaughn, you've been assigned as flight training advisor for the SEAL Special Operations Aviation Program. You'll coordinate cross-unit training and oversee air support readiness for high-risk deployments. My mind absorbed every word, but my body felt something else. A pull backward, a chill sliding down the spine of the present into the bone of the past. Then he added the part I already knew was coming. You'll be reporting directly to Admiral Vaughn. My stomach didn't twist. It locked. Like a door I had welded shut was suddenly forced open from the other side. I kept my face still neutral the way you learn to do when emotion is a liability. The officer mistook silence for calm. Good luck, Commander, he said, handing me the last of the files. You're going to need it. Later that afternoon, I stood outside the Admiral's office. The same door, the same smell of polished floors and metal. My hand hovered over the handle longer than I'd like to admit. It wasn't fear. Fear is loud. This was something quieter, older. The sound of a night long buried finding its way back through the cracks. When I pushed the door open, the first thing I saw was his back. Straight. Immaculate. He stood by the window with the Pacific behind him like a painted backdrop. His reflection in this glass was older lined with the weight of years, but his posture hadn't changed. It was the same posture that filled doorways and cast shadows where light should have lived. He turned. For a second, I saw his eyes flicker the way a man flinches at an old scar, but it passed fast, replaced by that smooth, composed expression I knew too well. "Lieutenant Commander Vaughn," he said like he was greeting a stranger. His voice carried no warmth. It never had. I returned the salute, my movements sharp controlled. "Sir?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I didn't sit. He noticed but didn't comment. He was good at pretending. We both were. He laid out the structure of my role, the expectations, the schedule. He spoke in clean lines, military protocol, leaving no room for ghosts. But they were there anyway in the air between us. The way he said my name felt like a challenge dressed as formality. Vaughn. He still owned it like it belonged to him, like my life had never drifted beyond the reach of his control. He didn't mention the past. He didn't need to. It lived in the silence behind every word. He talked about flight coordination, new SEAL teams cycling through mission profiles. I nodded at all the right moments. My face stayed calm, but inside, I was back on a kitchen floor with cold air in my lungs and pain in my ribs. That kind of memory doesn't ask permission to return. It just does. When I stepped back out into the sunlight, the air felt heavier. Not because of him. Because of what I had become since that night. I wasn't the girl he left on the floor. I was Reaper Zero. I had flown through storms that made men weep. I had carried dying soldiers out of places that tried to kill us all. But walking back into this base, hearing his voice again, felt like pressing my hand against an old scar and realizing it still burned. The breeze off the ocean couldn't wash it away. I walked down the main flight line past the hangars, past the maintenance crews, past rows of silent aircraft gleaming in the sun. My reflection flashed across the cockpit glass of a helicopter, and for a moment, I saw the girl I used to be, standing behind the woman I had become. I tightened my jaw. This was not his world anymore. It was mine. He might still hold the rank. He might still wear the uniform like armor. But I carried something heavier. I carried the storm that made the name Reaper Zero echo through corridors men like him used to control. The past hadn't disappeared. It was waiting here at Coronado like a long shadow. But this time, I hadn't come to hide beneath it. I had come to walk straight through it. The briefing room at Coronado was made of glass, steel, and arrogance. Light poured through the high windows like it was trying to burn away the smell of jet fuel that clung to everything. 40 officers filled the seats, their uniforms crisp, their faces relaxed in the way men looked when they believed the room belonged to them. I stood at the far end with a stack of flight coordination files tucked against my chest, listening to the low hum of casual conversation. Some of the younger officers threw quick glances my way, not out of respect, but curiosity, the kind reserved for someone they didn't think mattered. When William entered, the atmosphere shifted like wind hitting a flag. He didn't have to speak to command the room. Rank hung off him like armor. He took his place at the head of the long table, the Pacific sunlight behind him casting a pale halo around the man who had once broken me. He scanned the room, and for a fraction of a second his eyes locked on mine. No warmth, no acknowledgement, just an unspoken reminder of who he had always believed held the power. He began the meeting with his usual clipped precision outlining operations flight schedules and joint exercises. His voice filled the space like the sound of steel sliding into place. I listened silent, every muscle controlled, every breath measured. I had trained myself to remain calm in storms that could snap metal. I could endure this too. Then it happened. He shifted his weight slightly as if bored and glanced toward me. His voice softened just enough for the officers to lean in. "So, gentlemen," he said, turning to the table with a smile that wasn't a smile, "let's hope our lady pilot here can keep up." Laughter flickered through the room, quick and mean. A few tried to hold it back, most didn't bother. He continued, "Maybe she can handle the turbulence section. She probably knows it better than we do." The laughter grew louder. My pulse did not. It stayed steady like rotor blades cutting through wind. He had said the same kind of thing years ago when the bruise on my ribs was still fresh. The cruelty was never in the words alone. It was in how easily he spoke them, how certain he was that everyone around him would laugh. I felt the silver ring pressed against the inside of my palm. I hadn't realized I was gripping it until the metal dug into my skin. It had been my father's. He used to say precision is respect. William had tried to erase that voice. He hadn't succeeded. The sound of the officers laughing washed over me like cold water. I didn't shrink. I didn't flush with shame the way he expected. I lifted my chin slightly, letting the moment stretch longer than anyone was comfortable with. He expected me to break the silence with a joke to make it easy for everyone else. That was what women like me were supposed to do. Smile, absorb the insult, let it slide. But I had never been good at playing the part he wrote for me. He tilted his head, waiting. "What's your call sign again, sweetheart?" His voice carried the same poison as it had when I was 16. The laughter swelled again, bouncing off the steel walls. The young officers were still laughing when I spoke. Reaper 0, just 2 words. The sound hit the room like a blade dropped point first onto concrete. The laughter didn't fade slowly. It died instantly. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the creak of a chair, as someone shifted uncomfortably. One of the older SEAL officers froze mid-breath, recognition snapping into his face. Another one leaned forward like he wasn't sure he'd heard me right. Someone at the far end of the table whispered the name out loud, almost reverently, Reaper 0. I watched the realization ripple across the room. Every man who had laughed a moment ago now stared at me like I was a storm they hadn't seen coming. The silence deepened until it pressed against the walls. William's smile faltered for the first time in years. He blinked, and the mask he wore so well cracked just enough for me to see it. He hadn't expected me to use that name. He hadn't expected me to bring it into this room, to let it swallow his joke whole. He looked at me the way a man looks at a memory that refuses to stay buried. Commander Vic, sitting near the front, broke the silence. "Sir, she's the pilot from Bering." A low murmur followed men shifting in their seats, remembering a mission most had only heard about. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I let the name do what it had always done. It spoke for me. Reaper 0 was not just a call sign. It was a story written in storms and steel. It was the proof that I had gone where most wouldn't, and lived to tell about it. William's jaw tightened. His hands flattened on the table. He looked at me as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He tried to recover, tried to build the old smirk back on his face, but it was too late. The room was no longer his. The officers who had laughed now looked between us with the kind of caution you give to lightning. Power had moved without anyone saying it out loud. I held his gaze steady, feeling the burn of the ring in my palm, the cold edge of memory pressing against the present. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain who I was. The silence had already done that for me. He thought he could humiliate me like he always had as a joke, a throwaway line that made the room his again. Instead, he had handed me the knife. William Vaughn. The man who once made me bleed and called it a joke now stood frozen in the shadow of a name he could not control. Reaper 0. The same name that had once pulled men out of a frozen storm. The same name that made even the most arrogant SEAL fall silent. The ring in my hand warmed with the heat of my pulse. This time I didn't feel 16. I felt like the storm itself, and he knew it. The Naval Records building in San Diego was colder than any storm I had ever flown through, not because of the temperature, but because of the way silence clung to it like frost. The walls were white, the corridors narrow, and every door required a badge, a code, and a level of trust that most people never earned. It was late evening, the kind of hour when the building felt hollow, a shell filled with secrets that no one wanted to say out loud. Lexi Moore walked beside me with the nervous precision of someone who knew exactly how dangerous what we were about to do was. She was young, sharp, and too brave for her own good. Her clearance level was higher than mine. Her position gave her access to certain files. Files I had spent years knowing existed, but never had the power to touch. The hallway echoed with the sound of our boots as we turned the last corner. She glanced at me, once her voice low. "If we do this, there's no going back." I nodded. I had already burned the bridge to going back a long time ago. Inside the records room, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Rows of steel cabinets stretched across the room like ribs inside the chest of some old machine. Along the far wall, digital terminals flickered with quiet blue light. Lexi slid her badge across the scanner, typed a code I didn't recognize, and the screen blinked green. Access granted. She sat down quickly and motioned for me to close the door. I did. The sound of the lock clicking shut felt final. She began to type with the practiced speed of someone who had done this before for all the right reasons. Tonight, it wasn't for the right reasons. Tonight, it was for the truth. I stood behind her watching the screen come alive with layers of folders and clearance levels. My name wasn't in most of them, but his was. Admiral William R. Vaughn. The weight of that name sat heavy in the air like gunpowder. Lexi muttered something under her breath and dove deeper into the system, bypassing nested protocols. She wasn't just good at this, she was brilliant. She reached the archive section from 17 years ago. She whispered, "Here we go." The first file that opened was clean too clean. It was a report stamped official, a mission accident, 2 SEALs dead during a training exercise, weather complications, pilot error, signed off and archived. I felt my heartbeat slow. Not speed up, slow. That quiet, dangerous kind of calm that lives under the skin when the world starts to tilt. Lexi frowned at the screen. "Something's off," she said. She clicked into the metadata layer. That was where real stories lived, not in the polished reports, but in the fingerprints they left behind. She found a hidden version history. Multiple edits all signed under administrative clearance belonging to Vaughn. The deeper we looked, the uglier it became. The original report wasn't weather-related. The pilot had requested an abort due to a technical malfunction in the aircraft. That abort had been denied. By William Vaughn. The mission went ahead. 2 SEALs died on impact when the rotor malfunctioned mid-landing. The part that should have been investigated was quietly erased, folded into the clean version that lived in the archive. The blame was redirected toward pilot error. The pilot was a junior officer in training. Me. I stared at the screen as Lexi clicked through line after line of evidence, each one a nail sealing the coffin of my career before it had even begun. He had done it quietly, efficiently, the way powerful men erased things they didn't want remembered. I remembered the months after that mission, how every door I knocked on stayed closed, how every chance for a special assignment dissolved before I could reach it, how whispers followed me down hallways I couldn't escape. I thought it was bad luck. I thought it was me. I was wrong. It had been him all along. Lexi turned to look at me. Her eyes weren't nervous anymore. They were furious. "Commander," she whispered, "he buried you." I didn't answer. The sound in my chest wasn't rage. Rage is loud. This was something colder, older. A silence that started the night he broke my ribs and followed me into every room since. My jaw locked so hard it hurt. She kept digging. She pulled up the personnel logs from that same week. He had signed the denial himself. Then he had filed a supplemental report under his own clearance stating that the pilot had failed to respond appropriately to changing conditions. It was elegant, precise, a perfect trap. No one questioned the Admiral. No one ever did. Then Lexi found the last piece, a closed memo, internal only. It was a recommendation filed under his name stating that Lieutenant Trainee Vaughn was unfit for any high-risk operational advancement. That memo had been the quiet blade that cut my future before it started. It explained why I had spent years circling assignments without ever being allowed to step forward. It explained everything. I stared at the words until they blurred. I had spent so many years believing the worst thing he had done to me happened in that house when I was 16. I had carried that pain like a scar carved into bone. But this wasn't just pain. This was theft. He hadn't just hurt me. He had taken the sky from me. He had buried me alive beneath his version of the truth. Lexi exhaled hard, sitting back. "We have to be careful. If anyone sees this, they'll come after both of us." Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I took the printed copy she slid across the desk. The paper was warm from the machine, but it felt like ice in my hands. I folded it once and tucked it into my jacket. My father's ring pressed against it from the other pocket, the past and the evidence sitting side by side. For the first time in years, I felt something sharp and clear cut through the fog that had been wrapped around me since I was a teenager. This wasn't about surviving him anymore. This was about ending the storm he thought he owned. When we left the records room, the building was silent. The night outside was cold and still the kind of night where even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Lexi walked a few steps behind me. I could feel her fear and loyalty braided together in the air between us. She didn't ask me what I was going to do. She didn't need to. I stepped into the parking lot and looked up at the dark sky. For years, he had written my story for me. Tonight, I had stolen the pen back. And for the first time since that night in Annapolis, the silence belonged to me. Coronado at night carried a different kind of quiet. Not the peaceful kind that settles over a place when the world rests, but the kind that sits heavy as if the base itself is listening. The hangars lined up like sleeping beasts, their metal skin reflecting faint streaks of light from the distant pier. I stood at the edge of the flight line, the Pacific wind cutting across the concrete, and listened to the hum of distant generators. Behind me, Lexi Moore walked up without a sound, clutching a small encrypted drive. Her eyes were sharp alert, a mirror of the storm brewing between us. She didn't waste time with questions. She knew why we were here. This wasn't about digging anymore. It was about setting the trap. We moved into the operations room empty at this hour, except for the security hum of the building. The glow of the monitors gave Lexi's face a cold edge. She sat down at the terminal, plugged in the drive, and began pulling up internal security schematics. Coronado had cameras everywhere, but most of them were placed for operational oversight, not for exposing the kind of rot that grew in silence. She found the briefing room where William liked to hold his informal pre-training meetings, the same room he'd humiliated me in front of 40 officers, the same room where his voice echoed like it owned the air. She traced the camera angles and leaned back. If we get him here at this exact table, his voice will be recorded from 3 separate mics and 2 angles. No one can spin that kind of evidence. I nodded slowly. He was a man who relied on control, on power. He didn't need to be forced to humiliate me again. He would walk right into it the way a storm walks across open water. Predictable, arrogant. All we had to do was give him the spark. Lexi hesitated for a second. Are you sure about this? You could take the file straight to Jag. You don't need to bait him. I looked at her, the cold inside me as steady as the night. This isn't about what I need. It's about making sure the world sees what he really is, once. In the light. Over the next 2 days, we moved quietly. Every plan had to look like coincidence. Lexi filed the room scheduling under a legitimate training simulation. I adjusted the briefing notes to include operational coordination, something high enough to draw in his attention and pride. William loved to insert himself where he could be seen, where the room bent around his voice. Lexi made sure the security system would auto-back up all feeds to a shadow server she had access to through her clearance. The footage would duplicate to a location even the Admiral couldn't scrub clean. We rehearsed it like a mission. This time, the target wasn't a combat zone. It was him. On the morning of the meeting, the air on base felt sharp. People moved quickly, unaware of the quiet hunt happening underneath their boots. I dressed in my flight jacket, the old one I wore during the storm at Bering. It wasn't a uniform requirement. It was a message. He would recognize it the moment he saw me. It was the same jacket that carried the name Reaper Zero stitched into its fabric like a scar. Lexi arrived early and checked the security feeds twice. She was steady, but her hands twitched when she thought I wasn't looking. She wasn't used to standing this close to power and striking it. Few people were. I walked her through the sequence again, step by step, the way you'd prep for a high-risk flight. There's no shouting, no anger, I said quietly. That's what he wants. He feeds on control. We give him calm. We give him the mirror. When the officers started filing in, their voices filled the room with the usual chatter. It was strange, almost absurd, how normal everything looked. As if we weren't about to rip the mask off the man they'd followed for years. William entered with the same confident stride he always carried. The laughter that followed him was familiar. He scanned the room, saw me standing at the head of the table, and I saw the flicker of irritation cross his face like a shadow moving over water. He took his seat, leaned back, and waited. I began the briefing with the same quiet precision I used in flight. I laid out operational coordination points, spoke clearly, never once looking directly at him. I could feel his attention sharpening like a blade. He wasn't used to me leading the room. He didn't like it. And like every man who believed the world should bend to him, he couldn't stay silent long. "Well, gentlemen," he drawled, finally interrupting me mid-sentence, "looks like we've got Reaper Zero running the room." A few uneasy chuckles followed. He tilted his head at me with that same smile. "Be careful, sweetheart. Don't let the boys scare you with their war stories." More laughter, a little louder this time. He always thought laughter was proof of power. I didn't react. I simply placed my hands behind my back and looked at him with a calm that wasn't kindness. Calm was my weapon now. The silence after his joke stretched longer than anyone expected. The laughter faltered. His smile thinned. That was the thing about men like him, they needed others to laugh with them. When the room didn't, they started to show the cracks. "Sir," I said evenly, "I'm not the one who gets scared in storms. You know that better than anyone. I watched it happen." A small shift in his eyes, a flash of memory he didn't want to surface. Bearing. Reaper Zero. The storm he could never own. He leaned forward slightly, voice sharpening. "Careful, Lieutenant Commander. You wouldn't want to give anyone the wrong impression." I tilted my head. Or the right one. His jaw tightened. He stepped straight into the snare without realizing it. He started talking faster, his voice rising a little, mocking me like he always had. Like the girl he once bruised still lived somewhere under this uniform. But the room wasn't laughing anymore. The mics were catching every word, every drop of venom. Lexi, sitting quietly in the corner with a tablet, saw the confirmation light blink. Everything was being recorded. Then he made the mistake I had counted on. He called me sweetheart again in front of every officer present, his voice heavy with contempt, and added the same line he used the day he broke my ribs. "It's just a joke." The room went completely silent. Not because they knew the story, but because they could feel something shift, something they didn't understand yet. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight him here. He had already done it to himself. When the meeting ended, he walked out like he owned the ground beneath him, unaware that the walls had finally heard him for what he was. Lexi approached me slowly, the adrenaline still shaking her. "It worked," she whispered. "It's all on record." I exhaled for the first time that morning, the Pacific air sliding cold and clean down my throat. This was no longer a joke. It was evidence, and this time he couldn't erase it. The morning of the demonstration was sharp and clear, the kind of day when the sky felt endless and the air carried every sound like it wanted the world to hear. Coronado's training field stretched wide, flanked by hangars and the Pacific beyond. Hundreds of uniformed personnel stood in formation, a sea of dark blue and desert tan under the bright sun. Officially, it was a joint SEAL and aviation readiness drill. Unofficially, it was the day the mask would crack. William had arranged to lead the event himself. Of course he had. He loved crowds. He loved standing in front of them, pretending the world bent at the angle of his voice. I stood off to the side near the flight line jacket, zipped hands behind my back, watching him step onto the raised platform with the confidence of a man who believed nothing could touch him. His medals caught the light bright enough to blind anyone who didn't know the rot underneath. Lexi was positioned 20 yards away in the line of junior officers. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the small indicator on her secure tablet. Every camera feed on the field was active. Every mic. Every angle. She had synced the footage to the off-site drive 2 hours earlier. Even if the power went out, even if he tried to bury it, the record would live. William started with the usual formalities: mission readiness, operational excellence, brotherhood. The officers laughed in all the right places. He was in his element, the performance smooth and polished. He scanned the crowd, saw me, and something in his posture shifted. He loved an audience, and he loved a target. He turned toward me slowly like a man reaching for a weapon he thought was still his. "Commander Vaughn," he called out, "why don't you show these boys how the Reaper handles a little turbulence?" A ripple of laughter passed through the formation, easy, unthinking. They didn't know the story behind the name. Not yet. I walked forward each step, deliberate boots striking the concrete with the kind of precision my father had taught me when I was too young to understand why precision mattered. I stopped below the platform close enough that every soldier could see my face, and every camera could catch every word. His grin widened. "Don't be shy, sweetheart," he said the same way he had 17 years ago. "It's just a joke." The words were sharp, clear, cruel. They traveled across the field and landed exactly where I wanted them to. I felt the sting, but not the way I once did. This time it was the sound of a blade slipping neatly into the trap. I reached into my flight jacket and pulled out the drive Lexi had prepared. A small device unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it carried. I looked straight at him and spoke clearly. "Sir, you once said that. In this uniform, in a room full of people who laughed because they thought it was safe to do so. But it's not a joke anymore." I plugged the drive into the portable display terminal beside the platform. The big screen flickered to life. For a heartbeat, the crowd shifted restlessly, confused. Then they heard it. His voice, recorded with perfect clarity from the previous meeting. His words, the laughter, the line, "It's just a joke." The footage replayed from 3 angles showing his face as he mocked me in front of his officers. The laughter that had filled the room then died here in the open air. He froze. The confident stance that had defined him for years stiffened like a man caught in a storm without cover. I didn't stop there. The next file loaded automatically. The archived mission report, the hidden edits, the proof of the abort call denied, the falsified blame. Every soldier on that field heard the words from the original log clear as day. Pilot requested abort. Commander Vaughn denied. 2 SEALs dead. The silence that followed wasn't the soft kind. It was heavy, unforgiving. William's face went white, then red, his hands clenched at his sides. He stepped toward the edge of the platform and shouted, "Turn that off!" "That's classified." His voice cracked at the edges, a sound I'd never heard from him before. Not control, not command, panic. I didn't move. Neither did Lexi. She didn't have to. The feeds were already mirrored. Someone in the crowd whispered my call sign. Reaper 0. The sound spread like a spark catching dry brush. They knew the name. They had heard it in rumors. Now they were connecting it to the truth unfolding in front of them. William tried to speak again, but the words came out jagged, louder, desperate. "You don't know what you're doing. This is a violation." He looked less like an admiral and more like a man watching the walls close in. I stepped closer to the platform. "No, sir. This is a storm finally coming home." I said it quietly, but the mics picked it up. Every soldier heard it. He lost control then. His voice rose cracking into a shout. He hurled words at me, at the crowd, at the air itself, anything to pull back the power he'd just watched slip through his hands. But the more he shouted, the smaller he became. Every eye on that field saw him for what he was. His outburst turned chaotic. His words slurred with rage. Not drink, but something worse. Fear. "It's just a joke." He said it again as if repeating it would make it true. It didn't. It hung there, brittle, breaking apart in the cold morning air. I stood still. Not a hero, not a victim. Just the woman he had once underestimated standing under the same sun that now exposed him. This was never about revenge for the sake of pain. This was about truth. And truth, when it finally hits daylight, doesn't need to shout. By the time security stepped in, no one was laughing. Not a single soldier moved to stand between us. He had dug the hole himself. All I did was give him the silence he'd never expected to answer to. The hearing room in Washington, D.C. was nothing like the airfields I'd spent my life on. It was colder, sharper built, not for flight, but for judgment. High ceilings, dark wood. A long table where the Navy board sat beneath the crest that hung over their heads like an unblinking eye. Rows of seats filled the room, occupied by officers in dress blues, legal counsel, and observers who had come to see the storm unfold. Every movement echoed from the sound of shoes against polished floors to the soft shuffle of papers that would determine what happened next. I walked in, wearing my uniform, every ribbon in place, my boots polished until they caught the light. My hands didn't shake. They hadn't in years. But my chest carried a quiet weight, the kind that doesn't let you forget how much it costs to finally speak. At the front of the room, the chair of the hearing board called the session to order. The language was formal, detached, the kind of military cadence that wrapped itself around pain until it became procedure. Admiral William R. Vaughn sat on the opposite side of the room with his legal counsel. He wasn't wearing command blues today. He wore a dress uniform stripped of the easy arrogance I'd always known him to carry. His eyes flicked toward me as I took my seat with my JAG officer, Lieutenant Commander Julia Everett, beside me. Julia was calm, meticulous, the kind of legal mind the Navy built when it wanted to expose rot from the inside. She didn't look at me when she spoke softly under her breath. "You hold steady. We've got this." I nodded once. Lexi sat a few rows back in the witness section, hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, but her jaw was set. She'd stepped into this fight without hesitation. She was too young to be carrying weight like this, but she did it anyway. The proceedings began with formal statements, evidence submission, a timeline of events laid out in clean, sterile language. It sounded almost clinical when read aloud allegations of falsified mission reports, verbal harassment of subordinate officers, abuse of command authority. But nothing about this was clean. It was years of buried history rising up in the center of this room. The board allowed the evidence presentation first. Julia stood and plugged in the encrypted drive. The screens mounted behind the board lit up with a grainy but clear recording William in the briefing room. His voice, his words, the laughter. It's just a joke. His own arrogance weaponized against him. You could feel the ripple move through the room like a current under ice. The board members didn't move, but their silence changed. It was no longer empty. It was listening. Then came the mission logs. Lexi had prepared every timestamp, every clearance record, every hidden edit William had buried under his authority. The audio logs played aloud, the words unrolling like a blade across the table. Pilot requested abort. Commander Vaughn denied. 2 SEALs dead. The room didn't gasp. Military hearings don't sound like movies. But something in the air tightened the way pressure drops before a storm breaks. William sat stiffly, his jaw grinding, his fingers gripping the edge of the table hard enough to blanch the knuckles. His lawyer objected on procedural grounds. The board overruled without hesitation. These were his own words, his own signatures, his own trail of control. Julia sat down without smiling. She didn't need to. Truth didn't require ceremony. The board called Lexi next. She walked to the stand with the careful steps of someone who understood exactly how dangerous it was to speak against a man like him. She raised her right hand, took the oath, and answered their questions with precision. She described how the records were accessed legally under her clearance, how the evidence was preserved, how she had witnessed the meeting where the Admiral humiliated me in front of dozens of officers. Her voice never rose, but it didn't break either. When they dismissed her, she didn't look at me, but I could feel the thread of quiet solidarity between us. Then they called me. The room blurred for half a second when I rose. Not from fear, from the weight of time. 17 years ago, this man had taught me what silence cost. Today, I was going to make sure the world heard the bill in full. I walked to the witness table, raised my hand, and swore in. My voice was steady. Julia began with the structured part. My rank, my service record, my call sign, Reaper 0. The board members knew that name. Most of them had heard it in after-action reports or whispered in corridors that smelled of salt and steel. It wasn't the name of a victim. It was the name of a storm pilot who brought men home. And that was exactly why I was here. She guided me through the timeline. The mission, the falsified report, the years of silence. I answered with precision, each fact laid bare, each memory pulled into the light. And then, at her quiet nod, I took it further back. Annapolis, 16 years old, a house with cold walls. My mother's silence bought with threats. The night he called it a joke as I lay on the floor with broken ribs. I spoke it out loud for the first time in a room full of uniforms. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't dress it up. I spoke the facts as they were. I told them about the sound of my ribs cracking, about his voice calling me sweetheart as if pain belonged to him, about the way he walked out of that room and made the world believe nothing had happened. The room didn't move. The air didn't shift, but I could feel every eye on me. William erupted then, just as Julia had predicted. "That's enough!" he shouted, standing up, slamming his hand on the table. The board chair warned him once, but he ignored it. "She's lying," he barked. "She's always been weak." A ripple of discomfort crossed the faces of the officers in the audience. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, but he pulled away. He wasn't in control anymore. I stayed seated. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I let him unravel himself. Years of control eroding in real time. He pointed at me, shouting louder. "She's using a childish story to bury me. She's manipulating all of you. It's just a joke." The words came again, the same poison he'd used for years, but this time no one laughed. No one moved. His voice hit the silence and shattered against it. The board chair's voice cut through the air like a clean blade. "Admiral Vaughn, sit down." It wasn't a request. It was a command. And for the first time, he hesitated. That was the difference between then and now. He no longer owned the room. He sat back down, his breathing rough. His mask cracked so wide everyone could see the man underneath. Julia stood again, calm and exact. "The witness has presented documented evidence, recorded statements, and corroborated testimony from multiple officers. Admiral Vaughn has offered nothing but denial and emotional outburst. This isn't her storm anymore. It's his." The board members leaned in slightly, exchanging quiet looks. They had seen men like him before, men who built empires of silence and called it leadership. They knew the sound of those empires breaking. One of them turned to me and asked a simple question. "Commander Vaughn," why now I met his eyes and answered without hesitation. Because he spent 17 years calling my pain a joke. Today I gave it a name. You could have cut the silence that followed with a blade. The chair announced a recess so the board could deliberate. William sat slumped now, his hands clenched but his eyes unfocused. The man who had walked into this room thinking he still controlled the storm was watching it pass straight through him. I stood slowly, my knees steady. Lexi caught my eye as I walked past. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. When the board returned, the chair's voice carried the kind of cold authority only truth can bring. Admiral William R. Vaughn. Based on the evidence presented, this board finds that you knowingly falsified mission records, resulting in the death of 2 SEAL operators, committed repeated acts of harassment and abuse of authority, and violated the code of conduct expected of your rank. Effective immediately, you are relieved of command pending criminal proceedings. He didn't shout this time. He didn't even look at me. He just stared down at his hands. The hands that had built walls for years, as if he could still find the pieces of power he once held in his grip. There was nothing left to find. As they escorted him out, the air shifted again. Not because I had won, because the silence had finally stopped belonging to him. Public accountability is not a roar. It's a crack that runs through the structure of everything a man like him builds, and once it starts, nothing can hold it together again. I sat alone after the room cleared. The echo of boots faded down the hall. I looked at the table where he'd sat, the wood polished smooth from years of hearings, and thought of the 16-year-old girl who once lay on the floor, believing silence was forever. It wasn't. The storm had a name now, and everyone had heard it. The day after the hearing, Washington, D.C. felt unnaturally quiet, like the air itself had been rearranged. The headlines hit every military news outlet before noon. A decorated SEAL admiral relieved of command under investigation for falsified mission records and abuse of authority. The words were clean-clipped, stripped of emotion, but everyone who had been in that hearing room knew it was more than just another headline. It was the moment a man who had built an empire out of control and silence finally fell out of the sky. The photos showed him leaving the Naval Legal Facility under escort uniform still on, but stripped of everything that had once made him untouchable. No command pin, no weight behind his name, just a man walking alone in the light for the first time. I stood at the window of the hotel room overlooking the city, the kind of morning where everything looked sharp and unreal. My uniform hung over the back of the chair, the sleeves straight, the metals still catching the weak sunlight. Down below, reporters gathered at the Navy gate, microphones in hand, voices blending into a constant, restless murmur. Some of them were there for the scandal, some for the fall of a name they had once written in glowing profiles. They didn't know the story the way I did. They didn't need to. They just needed the truth to no longer be buried. The Navy issued its official statement within hours. Admiral William R. Vaughn had been relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending a full criminal investigation and court-martial proceedings. The statement mentioned integrity, accountability, and the standards of the service. It did not mention me. It did not have to. The evidence had spoken loud enough. For 17 years, his power had been built on the assumption that no one would ever drag the truth into the light. But light has a way of finding cracks. At Coronado, the fallout moved fast. The same officers who once laughed when he mocked me now moved through the base in silence. No one made eye contact when my name was mentioned. Whispers replaced laughter, quiet and sharp. They weren't whispers of pity. They were whispers of recognition, of how close they had stood to a storm without ever realizing it was coming. Lexi arrived at my hotel without knocking, still in her uniform. Her hair was pulled back tight, but exhaustion lived behind her eyes. She closed the door softly and leaned against it for a moment like someone who had been holding her breath too long. I turned from the window. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. She just exhaled and whispered, "Ma'am, the storm finally hit." I sat down on the edge of the bed, the words sinking into the quiet. For years, the storm had been mine alone. A private ache, a scar I carried without a name. Now it had a shape. It had hit the world he built, not the one he broke. Lexi stepped closer, her voice steadier now. "They're talking about reassignment at the top levels. He's done." I nodded slowly. She wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know. The moment his voice cracked in that hearing, his empire had cracked with it. The media was relentless. Reporters camped outside the base. Former officers who had once praised his leadership now spoke carefully, distancing themselves like men trying to outrun a shadow. Words like accountability and leadership integrity filled the headlines. None of them mentioned the 16-year-old girl lying on the floor of a house in Annapolis. But I did. In my own mind, I replayed the sound of his voice saying, "It's just a joke," the same line he had tried to hide behind until the end. It had been a weapon. Now it was evidence. Inside, the Pentagon doors that had always been closed to me opened. Not because they loved me, because they feared what came from ignoring the truth now that it was no longer silent. Meetings were held. Names were spoken in careful tones. Reputations began to shift like sand in wind. What he did was not just a personal act of cruelty. It was a breach of trust that cracked through the ranks like lightning through a tree. At Coronado, the officers who had laughed that first day now walked past me with quiet nods or none at all. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their regret. Their silence was enough. It was the silence that followed a storm no one saw coming. I flew to the base one last time that week, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it with the weight finally lifted. The hangars stood in their perfect lines. The runway gleamed in the late afternoon sun. The Pacific crashed against the shore beyond the wire. It looked the same, but I was not. As I walked down the line, I heard footsteps behind me. Lexi. She fell into step beside me, quiet at first. "You know," she said, "eventually a lot of people are afraid." I looked at her. Of what? She shrugged. Of the idea that someone untouchable wasn't untouchable after all. I didn't respond. She wasn't wrong. Power built on silence only looks solid until someone knocks on it hard enough. Then it shatters. News of his formal indictment came 2 days later. Charges of falsifying mission records, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming of an officer. Every headline wrote his name the same way they had always written it. But this time the tone was different. There was no reverence, no power, just a man facing the consequences he had spent years believing he was above. I stood again by the hotel window that night, looking at the city glowing under the thin skin of fog. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vengeance, just quiet. A quiet that wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. The kind of quiet that follows after years of wind and rain, when the storm has finally broken something that needed to be broken. Lexi texted me just before midnight. One line. It's over. I looked at the screen for a long time before typing back. No. It just started raining where it should have a long time ago. Then I turned the phone face down and let the silence settle in. The man who had spent his life controlling storms had finally learned what it felt like to be caught in one. Arlington National Cemetery was quiet in a way that no battlefield ever could be. The wind moved gently through the rows of white headstones brushing against the grass like it was afraid to disturb the dead. The sky hung low and gray, not heavy, just still. I walked along the narrow path lined with small flags and fresh flowers, each stone holding a name that once carried weight in the world and now carried silence. My boots sank slightly into the damp earth with every step. In my hand, I held the silver ring that had lived in my pocket for 17 years. My father's ring. It had followed me into storms, into hearings, into places I never wanted to go back to. It was warm against my palm as if it remembered everything with me. I stopped in front of his grave. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Vaughn, a man whose hands smelled of jet fuel and sea wind, a man who taught me that precision was respect long before I understood what the words meant. The headstone was clean, the letters sharp, the grass trimmed perfectly around it. Someone had left a small flag and a single white rose. I knelt down slowly, feeling the chill of the ground seeping through my uniform. For a long time I didn't say anything. The silence didn't ask me to. It just held me the way the cockpit used to hold me mid-flight. Steady. I turned the ring in my fingers, watching the light catch the scratches along its surface. It wasn't a perfect object. It never had been. But it had outlived everything that tried to silence it. My father had worn it the day he took me up on my first training flight, long before William ever stepped into our lives. He had wrapped my small hands around the flight stick and said, "You control the storm, or it controls you." I didn't understand it then. I did now. I pressed the ring gently against the cool stone and whispered the words he used to say to me when the world felt too loud. Precision is respect. The wind shifted slightly, as if carrying the words back to wherever he was. For years, I had carried this ring like armor, a small piece of someone who taught me to keep my spine straight, even when everything else tried to break it. Now, for the first time, I didn't need it to protect me anymore. I set it down on the edge of the stone, leaving it there as a quiet promise to the man who raised me right before the world tried to unmake me. It didn't feel like letting go. It felt like giving something back. The faint sound of footsteps behind me didn't make me turn. I didn't need to. Arlington wasn't a place where people intruded. Whoever passed knew to let silence have its moment. My phone buzzed softly in the pocket of my uniform. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but the world outside had kept moving even as my storm finally calmed. I pulled it out and saw Lexi's name flash on the screen. Her voice carried through the static, crisp but bright. "Ma'am, you're not going to believe this." I could hear movement in the background, the sound of a busy office. She took a quick breath and continued. "Command just called. They want to bring you in as an instructor for advanced tactical flight training. Permanent assignment, Coronado." Her voice faltered slightly the way it does when something good tries to break through years of hard edges. "They said they want the best to teach the next generation." I stared at the stone in front of me, at the ring resting there. The girl who had once lain on a kitchen floor with broken ribs would never have believed this moment could exist. Not after everything he did to bury me. Not after the years spent fighting storms no one else could see. But the woman standing here wasn't that girl anymore. She was Reaper Zero, and she had made sure no one would ever call that name a joke again. I lifted the phone slowly. "Thank you, Lexi." Her laugh cracked softly through the line. "You earned it, ma'am. They'll be lucky to have you." Then her voice softened even more. "You did it. The storm's over." I ended the call and stood brushing the grass from my uniform. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like something that had been pressing on my lungs had finally lifted. I looked down at the ring one last time. It caught a faint sliver of light breaking through the clouds. The wind moved again, curling around me like an old friend. I walked away without looking back. Not because I was leaving him behind, because for the first time in years, I didn't have to keep holding on. The weight of survival had shifted into something else. Something quieter. Something mine. As I reached the gate, the rows of white headstones faded into the distance behind me, a sea of lives that once carried storms of their own. I breathed in the cool air, steady and slow. I had spent years fighting to survive. Today, for the first time, it felt like I was finally allowed to live. Coronado's runway gleamed under the sharp California morning light. The Pacific wind moved across the flight line carrying the familiar scent of jet fuel and salt, the kind of air that got into your lungs and stayed there. It was the first day of the new tactical aviation training program. Rows of young pilots in flight suits stood at attention along the edge of the tarmac, their faces lit with a mixture of nerves and pride. The golden sunlight reflected off the canopies of the helicopters and aircraft behind them, cutting bright lines across the concrete. I walked toward them in full uniform, not because I needed the weight of it, but because it was mine now. Every stripe, every stitch, every step here belonged to me on my own terms. The instructors stood to the side, some of them men who had once laughed in briefing rooms where William had turned pain into a performance. None of them laughed now. Their silence carried something different these days, respect, or perhaps the quiet awareness that storms can turn. Lexi Moore stood next to me, her posture sharp, her new insignia gleaming on her collar. She had been promoted after the investigation closed, officially, named Assistant Instructor for Tactical Aviation. She still moved like someone not used to the weight of rank on her shoulders, but her eyes were clear and steady. She had earned it. I stopped in front of the line of pilots. They were young, some barely out of flight school, the kind of faces that still believed skill and discipline could bend the world their way. They didn't know my story. Not fully, but they knew the name. Reaper Zero. They had heard the whispers the way young recruits always hear them. Not as a tragedy, as a warning, as a legend carved into storm winds. I let the silence hang for a moment long enough for them to feel the weight of the place they stood. The same runway where I once walked as someone underestimated. The same airfield where power once belonged to someone else. Not anymore. "Good morning," I said finally, my voice carrying easily over the wind. "You're here because you're good, but skill alone won't keep you alive out there. What keeps you alive is what you decide to do when the storm hits." I watched their faces, saw their shoulders straighten. It wasn't the kind of speech they were expecting, but that didn't matter. I walked slowly down the line, my boots clicking against the concrete, the same way my father's did when he used to walk flight checks with me as a kid. "Precision is respect," he used to say. I never forgot. I stopped halfway down and turned toward them. "There's something I need you to understand before we begin. You'll fly into storms, into chaos, into moments where everything will try to tear you apart. Some of those storms will be outside. Weather, fire, gunfire. Some of them will be here." I tapped my chest lightly. And here, I tapped the side of my head. I could see Lexi watching me from the side, her lips tightening just slightly like she knew what I was about to say. People will try to make your pain small. They'll tell you it's nothing. They'll laugh when you hurt. They'll call it a joke. I kept my voice steady, letting each word land. Don't ever let them own your storm. Don't ever call pain a joke. Some storms hit back harder. The line of young pilots shifted subtle but real. Some of them lowered their eyes, understanding in ways they didn't want to say out loud. Others met my gaze and held it steady and defiant. They'd learn. Out there, the sky didn't care about jokes. It cared about who stayed standing when the wind screamed. Lexi stepped forward, then standing to my right shoulder squared. I remembered the girl who once came to me in a hallway, whispering that the way things were was just the way they were. And now she was standing here as an officer, a leader, a witness that storms don't have to last forever. I turned back to the class. "Over the next months, we're going to tear you apart and put you back together. We're going to make sure you can fly into the worst nights and bring people home. But if you walk out of this thinking courage is about who shouts the loudest, you've already failed. Courage is silence held steady against a storm." The roar of engines broke the quiet as the first set of helicopters warmed up behind us. The air vibrated with power, the kind that seeps into your bones. Sunlight caught the edges of the rotors as they spun, throwing streaks of gold across the faces of the pilots. It felt fitting. Lexi leaned in just slightly, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "You ever think about how far it's come?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the class. "Every day." We moved through the pre-flight demonstration together, guiding the students through their first coordinated formation exercise. The sky opened up wide above us, a clean blue that carried no shadows of the past. Watching the aircraft rise off the runway in a perfect staggered lift, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not just relief. Purpose. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. When the exercise ended and the young pilots stood in formation again, sweat on their faces and wind still pulling at their suits, I walked to the center of the tarmac and let my voice cut through the noise. Remember this, no matter who stands in front of you, no matter what rank they wear, no one owns your pain but you. No one gets to turn it into a punchline. Lexi stood beside me, head held high. This was no longer about survival. It was about legacy. She would teach when I couldn't. They would carry the storm differently. That was enough. The sun hung high, throwing gold across the field. The aircraft engines hummed in the background like an old heartbeat. For a brief moment, I thought about the girl I once was. 16. Cold floor, broken ribs, silence pressed into her bones. She would never have believed this future existed. She would never have believed that one day she'd stand here not as someone who was hurt, but as someone who outlived the storm. I faced the class one last time, my voice calm but sharp as a blade. If anyone ever calls your pain a joke, remember this moment. Remember who you are. And remember that storms don't stay still forever. Some of them hit back. The crowd of young pilots didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They just stood taller, the kind of taller that stays with you long after the day ends. The last helicopter took off behind me, the rotors sending warm wind across the tarmac. Sunlight wrapped around everything like gold spilled across the ground. For the first time, this place wasn't a battlefield, it was a beginning. If someone ever calls your pain a joke, will you let them stand on top of you forever, or will you stand up?